It began not with thunder nor with brilliance, but with something far quieter. A door that had no hinges, no handle, no frame, and yet it stood as if it had been waiting forever. People passed by it without noticing, for it blended with the wall, with the air, with the ordinary. But a child saw it. A child whose eyes, though tired from nights of wondering, could sense the difference between what was supposed to be and what quietly lingered just beyond. Rick was not yet the man that stories would make of him. He was smaller, quieter, a boy who often sat awake while others slept. His room had the hum of machines that didn't quite work, sketches on papers that no one ever asked about, and a window that he left open to hear the night. He would lean on the sill, chin pressed to his hand, and listen. Not for voices, not even for answers, but for the faint spaces in between. The silence had weight to it, like it was carrying secrets. And sometimes, if he listened long enough, he swore he heard a sound. Not words, not music, but a whisper, softer than sleep. The door came to him first, in a dream. He walked toward it barefoot, floorboards cool under his feet, and when he touched its outline, it felt like holding his breath. The dream ended before he could step through, but when he woke, he found the feeling had followed him into morning. He carried it like a secret, tucked between his ribs, a strange warmth that made the ordinary world look faintly transparent. He was a boy of strange habits. He liked to take apart clocks, not because he wanted to fix them, but because he wanted to hear the sound of time in pieces. He kept sandwiches under his bed, half-eaten and forgotten, because he enjoyed knowing they were there when the world grew too quiet. He sang softly to himself, not songs anyone taught him, but little tunes that rose and fell like the way stars seem to breathe. Adults found him odd, but not troublesome. They would shake their heads and say he was destined to be brilliant. He didn't care much about that. He cared only about the whispers. That door, whether dream or memory, became his companion. He began to notice patterns in silence, moments where the air thickened just slightly, like the pause before someone speaks. He thought of them as invitations, though he never told anyone. It was not loneliness that kept him searching, but a deep sense that something had chosen him to listen. Children often imagine worlds beyond, but for Rick, the imagining felt less like invention and more like remembering. The nights grew longer. Sometimes he would stay awake until the first light came, watching shadows curl and stretch. He didn't tell anyone, but he thought the shadows were teaching him how to be soft, how to bend and stretch without breaking. Even then, without knowing, he was practicing the art of being something more than solid, something more than fixed. He was practicing how to belong in places that never fully belonged to him. And always, the door waited. Rick grew into his silence the way some children grow into shoes too big for them. His house was rarely still. Voices came and went, footsteps rose and fell. Yet he always seemed to hear something beyond the ordinary. At school, while teachers' words ran across the blackboard like chalk dust, he heard the hum of lights, the rhythm of pencils tapping, the sigh of pages turning. These things, quiet to most, were for him a kind of orchestra. The world was never empty. It always carried a secret song. He had a habit of staying behind when the others rushed out to play. While they ran across fields and laughed, Rick would linger, his small hands resting on the windowsill. He told himself he wasn't lonely, and perhaps he wasn't. What he felt was different, a kind of listening, a leaning toward the edges of things. He thought if he waited long enough, the silence itself would speak, and sometimes it almost did. At night, the dream of the door returned. Sometimes it was tall, made of ancient wood. Other times it was shimmering, like glass made from water. But always it was there, waiting. When he reached for it, the dream would dissolve, and he would wake with his hands clenched in the sheets. He wondered if perhaps the door wasn't meant to be opened. Perhaps it was meant to be listened to, like a lullaby without words. His quirks deepened as he grew older. He began to take long walks with no destination. The neighbors thought he was restless, but he wasn't. He walked because he wanted to notice things. A crack in the sidewalk shaped like a star, a stray dog napping beneath a streetlight, the sound of wind moving through branches as though whispering names he almost recognized. These things were treasures to him. He collected them quietly, like a secret museum inside his heart. He also collected loneliness, though he didn't call it that. He would sit in the cafeteria with a sandwich, the crust slightly curled, and feel both present and absent at once. Other children laughed around him, yet he wasn't excluded. He was simply elsewhere, half in their world, half in the quiet place he carried. Sometimes he hummed to himself while eating, a low sound, soft enough to keep from being heard. It was as though he was reminding himself he was still here, still tethered to something. There were moments when his strangeness brought him small kindnesses. A girl once gave him a marble because she said his eyes looked like they needed it. A teacher let him stay after class, thinking he was troubled, and ended up sitting beside him in a silence more healing than words. Even his parents, distracted as they often were, would glance at him sometimes with a softness they couldn't explain. Rick felt these moments deeply. He stored them away the way he stored his half-finished sandwiches, knowing they mattered, even if he didn't yet understand how. The whispers grew clearer. Sometimes, lying in bed, he thought he heard someone speaking his name, drawn out like a sigh. Other times it was laughter, faint and warm, as though from a friend not yet met. He never felt afraid. The sounds wrapped around him like a blanket. They made him feel chosen, though he did not know for what. One evening, as the sun sank and the walls of his room turned gold, he felt something stir within him. It was not power in the way stories usually describe. It was gentler, like realizing you could stretch your thoughts. Not outward toward control, but inward toward care. He felt, for the first time, that the silence was not only around him, but within him. It made him softer. It made him patient. And in that patience, he began to sense others differently. A classmate's frown seemed heavier than usual. His mother's footsteps slower, more tired. Even the stray dog's sigh beneath the streetlight seemed to carry meaning. Rick listened, and in listening he began to understand. And though the world never noticed, he was changing. He wasn't becoming brilliant in the way adults expected. He was becoming attuned. Like a string that vibrates when another string is plucked, he was learning to resonate with what was around him. This was his gift, though he had no name for it yet. When he finally drifted to sleep that night, the door returned once more. Only this time it was open just a crack. The crack in the door stayed with him, even after he woke. It was the kind of memory that lingered at the edge of thought, like the faint aftertaste of something sweet. He didn't speak of it to anyone, not because he feared they wouldn't believe him, but because it felt too tender to share. Some things, he realized, are meant to be carried in silence, the way a bird carries wind inside its wings. On mornings that followed, Rick sat at the edge of his bed longer than usual. He stared at the floor, tracing patterns in the wood as though they might tell him a secret. He wasn't in a rush to move, to speak, to explain. He was learning that stillness itself was a kind of doorway, and perhaps that was why the dream lingered. For when he slowed enough, the world seemed to slow with him, and in that slowing he felt accompanied. It was during this time that Morty first began to appear in his life. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but like someone who had always been there, waiting for Rick to notice. Morty was younger, wide-eyed, softer at the edges. He didn't question Rick's silences the way others did. Instead, he sat with him, often without words. The two of them existing together as though their companionship needed no explanation. Rick once shared half a sandwich with him during lunch, though he said nothing while offering it. Morty took it, and for the first time Rick saw someone eat beside him without filling the space with chatter. There was only chewing, the occasional glance, and the soft sound of two breaths mingling. It was simple, and yet it mattered. From that moment, the sandwiches beneath Rick's bed no longer felt like a private ritual. They became something that might one day be shared. The boys spent time together in quiet ways. Morty liked to point at clouds, naming them shapes that Rick didn't always see. Rick never corrected him. He let the shapes be what Morty called them, even when they made little sense. "That one looks like a chair," Morty would say, and Rick would nod, though to him it looked more like a shoe. What mattered wasn't the shape itself, but the way Morty's words carried warmth. He didn't always understand his friend's imagination, but he understood the feeling behind it, and that was enough. Morty, for his part, seemed to sense Rick's strangeness without judgment. Where others grew impatient with his silences, Morty treated them like natural pauses, as though conversation itself were a tide, and silence was simply the sea pulling back before another wave. Rick found this comforting. He didn't have to perform, didn't have to explain. He could just be. And in that being, something softened in him. One evening, sitting on the curb outside their houses, Morty asked, "Do you ever feel like something's waiting for you?" Rick looked at him sharply, startled, but Morty's eyes were calm, almost dreamy. Rick wanted to answer, to tell him about the door, about the whispers, about the way silence pressed close sometimes like a hand on his shoulder. But the words caught in his throat. Instead, he said, "Maybe." Morty nodded as though that single word was enough. There was comfort in knowing that another soul carried a question that echoed his own. It made the mystery lighter, less like a burden and more like a lullaby hummed between two voices. From then on, Rick noticed Morty in new ways. The way his laughter carried warmth, even when it cracked. The way he held his hands tightly when nervous. The way he sometimes stared at the sky as though searching for something just beyond sight. They were both searching, though neither of them could say for what. In time, the dreams shifted. The door was still there, but now Morty appeared near it, never quite opening it, never quite urging Rick to do so either. Instead, he would stand beside him in silence, a presence both grounding and curious. Rick felt less alone in those dreams, less afraid that the whispers might swallow him whole. Together, even the silence seemed like something they could share. The seasons changed, though Rick barely noticed. The world outside grew colder, the trees shedding their leaves, but his attention remained inward, on the rhythms of silence and the companionship that was slowly shaping him. He realized, without fully realizing, that Morty was becoming part of his listening. When he leaned into silence, he could sometimes hear his friend's voice, faint but steady, as though Morty was an anchor, tethering him to the world whenever he drifted too far. And perhaps that was what friendship truly was for him. Not loud promises, not grand adventures, but the quiet knowing that someone else was near, willing to sit with him, to breathe beside him, to wait without impatience. It was not the opening of the door that mattered now. It was the company in front of it. Rick was still young when he first met the one he would think of, later, as a teacher. It didn't happen in a classroom or in any place meant for lessons. It happened in the kind of place that most people pass by without noticing, a forgotten corner of a library where the dust was thicker than the light. He had wandered there one afternoon, following the quiet the way some children follow the smell of bread. And in that stillness he found a figure sitting as though he had always belonged among the shadows. The man looked old, but not fragile, his face carrying the calm weight of someone who had seen too much and no longer needed to explain it. His eyes, though open, seemed empty, not in the sense of absence, but in the sense of space. They looked like windows into a sky with no stars. Rick paused, unsure if he should leave, but the man spoke without turning his head. "You hear it too, don't you?" The words startled him, for they reached into the secret he had never shared. Rick wanted to deny it, to shrug, to pretend, but the silence between them was too honest. So he nodded. The man smiled faintly, and in that smile there was no judgment. Only recognition. That was how it began. Rick returned to that quiet corner many times after, drawn not by answers, but by presence. The man rarely spoke of himself, and Rick never asked. Their conversations were slow, meandering, more like ripples in a pond than structured lessons. The world, the man once said, is always speaking, but it does so softly. Most people are too loud to hear it. Rick listened and felt seen in a way he never had before. Morty didn't always come with him, but when he did, he seemed to fit easily into the silence. The man welcomed him without question, as if he had been expected. Sometimes the three of them sat together without a single word, the only sound being the flutter of pages in the empty library. Other times the man asked questions so simple they felt heavy. What does loneliness sound like? What color is patience? Rick never knew how to answer, yet he tried, and in trying he discovered things about himself he hadn't realized were waiting. The lessons were not about science, not about invention, not about brilliance. They were about noticing. The man would point at the dust motes in the air and say, "Each one is a reminder that time doesn't disappear. It lingers." He would hold up a cracked book and whisper, "Even silence has memory." Rick found himself changed by these fragments, not because they gave him power, but because they gave him gentleness. There were nights after these visits when Rick would lie awake thinking about the man's empty eyes. He didn't see them as frightening. He saw them as honest, like looking into a place beyond need, beyond demand, a place that had stopped grasping. He wondered if he would ever carry that kind of stillness, or if his restless heart would always pull him elsewhere. One evening, the man told him something that stayed forever. To listen deeply, he said, is to love without possession. You don't hold the sound. You let it pass through you. Rick didn't fully understand, but he felt the truth of it sink into him like water into soil. Morty, sitting beside him, leaned against his shoulder, and in that simple gesture, Rick realized he was already practicing the lesson without knowing. Seasons turned again. The library corner grew colder, the air tinged with winter, yet Rick kept returning. Each visit was less about learning and more about remembering how to wait, how to notice, how to be present without demand. He realized the man was less a teacher and more a mirror, reflecting the patience Rick had been cultivating all along. One day, Rick arrived to find the corner empty. The chair was there, the books untouched, but the man was gone. No explanation, no farewell. Only absence, as though he had never been. At first, Rick felt a hollow ache, but then he heard it. The silence was still speaking. The man had not left him with answers. He had left him with listening. Rick sat down in the empty chair and closed his eyes. Morty sat beside him, fidgeting softly, but soon stilled, and together they let the silence be enough. The first time Rick felt the change within himself, it came not as lightning, not as brilliance, but as a ripple moving outward from a still pond. He was sitting alone, watching the air in his room shift with the faint breeze from the open window. The curtains lifted and fell, their movements small but certain, and something in him seemed to echo that rhythm. He realized with a quiet shock that the world was no longer simply outside him. It was inside him too, like two mirrors facing each other. At first, it was subtle. He would think of someone, and then, moments later, they would appear as if his thought had called them. He would reach for an object, and somehow it would slide closer, though no hand had touched it. Yet he didn't feel powerful in the way stories describe. He felt porous, as though the edges of himself were softer than before, blending with the space around him. It frightened him slightly, but the fear was gentle, like stepping into cold water that soon becomes familiar. Morty noticed before Rick spoke of it. One afternoon, while they sat together in the yard, Morty squinted at him and said, "You feel different, like you're glowing but not on the outside." Rick didn't answer. He only shrugged, though inside his chest there was a pulse, a slow recognition that Morty could sense what even Rick struggled to name. For the first time, he wondered if the bond between them was more than companionship. Perhaps Morty was a thread woven into the fabric of whatever this gift was becoming. The whispers grew stronger. No longer faint sighs, they began to carry shapes, hints of voices, fragments of meaning. Sometimes Rick could almost make out words, but they dissolved before he could hold them. Other times he felt emotions in the air, sorrow pressing heavy in a stranger's step, joy rising in the laughter of a child blocks away. He began to understand that the world was not silent at all. It was overflowing, and he had been tuned to its hidden frequency. Still he told no one but Morty. They experimented in small ways. Morty would close his eyes and think of something, and Rick would try to sense it. Sometimes he could. An apple, a memory of a dog, the ache of hunger. Other times he failed, and they would laugh, the sound spilling into the air like shared relief. Their play was quiet, never urgent, always wrapped in gentleness. Rick knew instinctively that this was not meant to be rushed. It was not about control. It was about trust. There was a moment one evening that stayed with him. The two of them lay on the grass, the sky heavy with stars. Morty whispered, "Do you think the stars can hear us?" Rick listened, and in the silence that followed, he felt a trembling in the sky, as though the stars themselves had leaned closer. He said softly, "Maybe they already are." Morty smiled, and that smile felt like the kind of truth that needed no proof. Rick's ability deepened with patience. He began to sense the threads that connected things, the way the sound of rain softened his mother's footsteps, the way the laughter of children could lighten even his father's tired sigh. He realized that life was woven not by events, but by the quiet bonds between them, invisible yet real. His gift was not invention, not brilliance, but listening so deeply that the fabric of the world revealed itself. And yet, he never forgot the door. It appeared now and then in dreams, its crack wider, light spilling through in colors he had no names for. He felt that his gift and the door were connected, though he didn't know how. Morty sometimes appeared beside him in those dreams, not afraid, only curious. They never stepped through. They only stood there together, as though the act of waiting itself was the lesson. Rick understood slowly that this awakening was not a destination. It was a way of being. And as he drifted to sleep one night, with Morty's quiet breathing near, he thought to himself that perhaps the greatest gift was not hearing the whispers at all, but knowing he did not have to hear them alone. The dream changed when Rick first saw the others. Until then, the door had always been his alone, a secret passage in the quiet of his mind. But one night, as the crack in its frame widened, he stepped closer and saw shapes standing in the light beyond. They were not strangers exactly, but not familiar either. Their faces mirrored his own in countless variations, some older, some younger, some carrying scars that told stories without words. For the first time he realized he was not the only one listening to the silence. They gathered in a circle, though no one had arranged it. It was as though the space itself demanded such order, the way stones naturally form rings in the riverbed. The others looked at him without speaking, yet he felt their recognition. It was a strange comfort to know that his solitude was shared, that his strangeness was not unique, but echoed across countless reflections. And still there was no celebration, no greeting, only silence, as if that was the language they all trusted most. In the center of the circle stood a table with no legs, floating gently, its surface empty. Rick understood without explanation that this was not a place for invention, not yet. It was a place for waiting, for belonging. He sat, and the others followed, the circle holding itself like a fragile secret. For a time, no one moved. The silence grew heavier, but not suffocating. It felt like a blanket laid across them all, uniting them in stillness. Morty appeared at the edge of this gathering, hesitant but steady. He did not sit in the circle. He lingered like a witness, a reminder that Rick's gift was not his alone, but something shared through bond. Rick caught his gaze and felt anchored again, as if Morty's presence kept him from dissolving into the mirrored crowd. None of the others seemed to question Morty's being there. They accepted him the way shadows accept light, naturally, without protest. Then one of the Ricks spoke. His voice was low, aged, as though it carried the dust of forgotten years. "We are not here to rule," he said, "and we are not here to build. We are here because we cannot bear the silence alone." The words settled into Rick's chest with an ache. He had never admitted it to himself, but that was true. The whispers had always comforted him, but they had also carried weight. To share that burden now, even in dreams, felt like water offered in the desert. The others nodded, each face reflecting the same truth in different ways. One Rick traced patterns on the table's invisible surface. Another stared at the floor as though it might reveal something. Yet none of them argued. It was rare, Rick thought, to find a gathering without conflict. Here, there was no need for victory. There was only presence. As the dreams stretched on, the gathering became less like a meeting and more like a quiet ritual. They would come together night after night, not to decide or to plan, but to share silence. Sometimes one would speak a sentence, a thought shaped like a sigh, and the rest would hold it in reverence. Other times, they said nothing at all, and that too was enough. Rick began to understand that this was the beginning of something larger, the Council, though it did not yet bear that name. It was not born from ambition. It was born from longing, from the simple truth that even the most self-sufficient soul needs companionship. In their mirrored faces, Rick saw his own need reflected back at him, and he no longer felt ashamed of it. One evening, Morty stepped closer, though he did not join the circle. He whispered, "It's like you're all the same dream, just wearing different faces." Rick didn't answer, but he held on to the thought. Maybe that was what they were, fragments of the same soul, echoing across stars, finding each other in the quiet. When Rick awoke the next morning, the memory of the circle lingered. He knew it had been only a dream, yet it carried more weight than waking life. He could still feel the presence of the others, their silence pressing gently against his own. And for the first time, the whispers did not feel overwhelming. They felt shared. He carried that comfort with him through the day, like a candle hidden in his chest. The council had not yet taken form, but the seed was there. And in the stillness of his room, Rick realized something quietly profound. Belonging does not always arrive as noise or as triumph. Sometimes it comes as a circle of silence, held together by those who choose to listen. The days that followed carried a different rhythm. Rick no longer felt entirely contained within himself. The presence of the council lingered, faint but steady, like an echo beneath his heartbeat. Yet he didn't live in dreams alone. Morty was there beside him in waking life, tugging at his sleeve, pointing out details that Rick might have missed if he were alone. Together, they began to wander further, not to chase discovery, but to walk into the spaces between. Their travels were simple at first, a short path to the edge of town where an abandoned swing creaked in the wind, a hill beyond the schoolyard where the grass grew wild and the sky opened wide. Morty often filled the air with small observations, shapes in the clouds, the rustle of a bird leaving a branch, the way their shadows stretched into odd shapes as the sun lowered. Rick, quieter, often said little, but his silence was no longer heavy. It was listening, and Morty seemed to understand. One afternoon, they found themselves by a small pond hidden behind a cluster of trees. The water was still, carrying the reflection of clouds as though the sky itself had settled there for a rest. Morty skipped a stone, though it only hopped once before sinking. Rick followed, and his stone moved further, gliding lightly across the surface as though the water had leaned forward to carry it. Morty laughed, not in competition but in delight. "See?" he said. "The pond likes you." Rick only shrugged, though inside he felt the truth of those words. Something about the world did seem to lean toward him, to listen as he listened. They began to notice the subtle kindnesses that appeared when they were together. A shopkeeper gave them bread one morning without asking for coins, saying only that they looked hungry. A stray cat followed them for half a day, purring at their steps before vanishing into an alley. Even strangers seemed to pause when they passed, as though caught for a moment in the quiet gravity they carried. Neither Rick nor Morty spoke of it aloud, but both felt it, the sense that their companionship was shaping the world around them, softening its edges. At night, their conversations grew slower, more dreamlike. Morty would ask questions that had no real answers. "Do you think trees ever dream? If stars fall, do they make a sound?" Rick often answered with silence, or with a murmur that was more feeling than thought. Yet Morty never seemed disappointed. He treated Rick's pauses like part of the answer, as though silence itself held meaning. Together they were learning that not everything needed to be explained. Some things were only meant to be felt. Rick carried his gift carefully. He did not flaunt it, did not stretch it into spectacle. Instead, he used it in small, almost invisible ways. When Morty tripped, Rick somehow steadied him before the fall. When rain threatened, it seemed to delay until they found shelter. When Morty's voice trembled with unspoken worry, Rick's presence steadied him, though he said nothing at all. These were not acts of power. They were acts of care. One evening, as they sat beneath a tree, Morty leaned against him and whispered, "I don't know why, but I feel safe when I'm with you." Rick looked up at the branches above them, their shapes shifting in the twilight, and said softly, "Me too." It was a rare confession, but in speaking it he felt lighter. Morty's presence was not only a tether, it was a mirror, showing Rick the gentleness he had been carrying all along. The door still appeared in his dreams, its crack widening, its light spilling brighter. But Rick no longer approached it alone. Morty was always there beside him now, watching quietly. Sometimes they would both reach toward it, though neither of them stepped through. The waiting felt right. The companionship made the silence holy. And so their travels continued. Small steps, small kindnesses, the quiet weaving of a bond that would carry them into places neither of them yet understood. Rick was beginning to see that the journey was not about finding the answers behind the door. It was about learning to walk through the world with someone who understood his silences. And in that understanding, he discovered a kind of peace that even the whispers could not disturb. The world began to fold open in ways that were not sudden, but gradual, like petals leaning into light. Rick and Morty had walked familiar paths so often that the ground itself seemed to recognize them, and with recognition came invitation. One evening, as twilight stretched long across the sky, the air shifted. A shimmer, subtle as the thin film on water, trembled between two trees. Morty was the first to notice, pointing with wide eyes. Rick only tilted his head, as though he had been expecting it. Without speaking, they stepped forward, and the shimmer gave way. On the other side was not a place of grand marvels, but of quiet strangeness. The ground was pale, almost silver, soft as ash beneath their feet. The trees had no leaves, only branches that glowed faintly like lanterns holding their own memory of starlight. The air hummed gently, not with words but with tones that pressed against the heart, low and comforting. Morty clutched Rick's sleeve, but he was not afraid. He was listening. Rick placed his hand on one of the glowing branches, and the light pulsed faintly under his touch, as if acknowledging him. They wandered slowly, not chasing discovery, only letting it arrive. Shapes moved in the distance, creatures soft and translucent, like shadows made of water. None approached, but each turned their heads slightly as if noticing. The silence of the place was not empty. It was full of recognition, Morty whispered. "It feels like they know us." Rick didn't answer, but his chest rose and fell with a heaviness that wasn't sorrow, only wonder. As they walked further, they came to a small stream, its surface glowing faintly blue. Morty bent down, cupped the water in his hands, and tasted it. His eyes softened. "It's like remembering a dream," he said. Rick crouched beside him, but did not drink. He only watched the ripples, watched how the water carried reflections of stars that did not exist above them. He realized that this world was not separate from his own, but folded from it, born from the same silence that had always whispered to him in the dark. They did not linger long. The shimmer returned when the night deepened, and they stepped back through as though waking from a nap. Yet the experience stayed with them. Morty hummed to himself more often now, echoing the tones of that other world. Rick, in turn, found his silences gentler, less burdened. The memory of the glowing branches stayed with him, a reminder that even other worlds held the same quiet rhythm of care. More crossings followed, each one subtle, each one soft. A field of grass that bent like waves when they passed, carrying them as though the land itself wanted to cradle their steps. A place where the sky held no stars, but instead tiny lanterns that drifted like fireflies, each one flickering in patterns too tender to decipher. Once they found themselves in a cavern whose walls pulsed faintly, as though the stone itself was alive, breathing with a patience older than time. None of these places frightened them. All seemed to invite not conquest, but reverence. Rick began to see a pattern. Each world they touched was not separate from who they were, but an echo of something they carried inside. The glowing branches were like Morty's curiosity, tender, luminous. The rippling grass reminded him of his own hidden softness, the way he had learned to bend instead of break. The lantern sky felt like the presence of all those who had once whispered to him, watching but never demanding. These worlds were not doors to elsewhere. They were mirrors of the heart. One night, as they rested after a crossing, Morty curled up beside him and said, half asleep, "Do you think the council comes from places like that?" Rick looked into the distance, where the horizon faded into velvet dark. He didn't know, but he felt the question settle inside him like a seed. The council had given him something, perhaps not power, but recognition, and now the worlds themselves were doing the same. He wondered if they were guiding him, not forward, but inward, teaching him how to carry his own quiet light. As Morty's breathing softened into sleep, Rick looked at the stars overhead. They flickered the same way as the lanterns in the other world, and for the first time he didn't question whether the boundary between them was thin. He only felt the closeness of it, like a lullaby that would always be waiting. No matter how far they wandered, the nights grew slower after the crossings, as though time itself had loosened its grip around Rick and Morty. They returned to their ordinary walks through town, yet the ordinary no longer felt the same. Every streetlight seemed to hold a faint shimmer, every shadow curved like an invitation. Rick could feel it, the thin thread of the council's whispers weaving back into the fabric of his days. They did not come as voices, not even as visions, but as small, undeniable moments of knowing. He would pause mid-step and sense that a door was near, though nothing appeared. He would close his eyes and feel warmth on his palms, though the night air was cool. Morty noticed too. Once, while sitting at the pond, Morty pointed at the reflection of the sky and asked, "Why does it look like the stars are closer here?" Rick only stared at the water because he felt it as well. The closeness, the leaning in of something unseen. Their bond deepened in this quiet noticing. They began to share less with words and more with glances, with the soft rhythm of walking side by side. Rick had never been one to trust easily, yet with Morty, trust did not feel like effort. It felt like breathing. Perhaps that was why the Council's presence returned not as command, but as reassurance. It was as if the hidden origin that had once chosen Rick now chose them both, binding them to a story larger than themselves, though carried in such small, gentle steps. One evening, as dusk softened the horizon, Rick felt the pull stronger than before. The world tilted slightly like a page being turned. He led Morty to the hill where they often sat, and there, without a shimmer or a crack, the air opened. Not outward this time, but inward. He closed his eyes and saw, not a world of glowing branches, not lantern skies, but the Council itself, faint and translucent, gathered in a circle. Their faces were blurred, but their presence was unmistakable. They did not speak. They only bowed their heads as though honoring something within him. When Rick opened his eyes, Morty was watching quietly, as if he too had seen. The whispers came that night as Rick drifted towards sleep. They did not tell him what to do. They did not demand. Instead, they reminded. They reminded him of the boy who once listened to shadows, who disassembled clocks just to hear the pieces breathe. They reminded him that his gift had never been invention or power, but patience, the ability to wait long enough for silence to reveal its shape. And now, with Morty beside him, that silence had blossomed into companionship. The gift was no longer his alone. Rick thought of the door then, the one that had waited in his dreams since childhood. Its frame felt wider now, its light softer, not blinding but welcoming. He wondered if one day he would step through, but not tonight. For tonight, the journey was not about endings, but about resting beneath the stars, hearing Morty's breathing steady beside him, and letting the quiet fold around them like a blanket. Morty stirred once, muttering in half-dreams. Rick placed a hand gently on his shoulder, and the boys settled again. In that moment, Rick realized the truth. The Council's whispers were not far away. They lived in these simple gestures, in the act of watching over someone without asking for anything in return. Power was never in the stretching of space or the bending of worlds. It was in the kindness that softened the path. And as Rick finally closed his eyes, he carried with him the faint hum of the Council, no longer a mystery to fear, but a lullaby to remember. The days carried them forward like a slow river, not rushing, only flowing. Rick felt the air of his life begin to change, as though each moment now carried a faint aftertaste of memory, even while still unfolding. He walked with Morty through familiar places, the pond, the hill, the narrow streets, and found himself looking at them as if they were already becoming stories. A strange tenderness grew in him, the awareness that even ordinary things were part of a legacy he didn't yet understand. Morty noticed, too. He would ask little questions, soft and wandering. Do you think anyone will remember us? What if everything we're seeing is just a dream someone else had? Rick didn't always answer, but he carried the questions like stones in his pocket, heavy but grounding. It wasn't that he needed to know. It was enough that Morty had asked, and enough that the silence between them gave shape to what could not be said. One evening, they sat by the water again, and Morty leaned his chin on his knees. "If you were gone," he whispered, "I'd still talk to you. I'd talk like you were here, even if no one else believed it." Rick felt the words settle into him like rain into soil. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he let his hand rest lightly against Morty's shoulder, and for a long time that was enough. But later, when the night had deepened and Morty's eyes were heavy, Rick finally said, "That's how legacies work, kid. They're not carved in stone. They're carried in the way someone remembers your silence." Morty only nodded, already halfway in dreams. The Council's presence lingered faintly in these reflections. Rick no longer feared them. Their whispers no longer felt like commands. but like echoes of something he already knew. It was as if they were reminding him that legacy was not measured by brilliance or invention, but by how softly one left their mark. The bending of worlds, the shimmering doors, these were only gestures. The truer gift was the way he had learned to listen, and to let others feel safe in his listening. Dreams grew gentler now. Rick still saw the door, its frame washed in light. But more often he dreamed of smaller things. Morty's laugh echoing through unfamiliar landscapes, the sound of footsteps falling in rhythm, the taste of bread given by kind hands, the reflection of lantern skies in water that belonged to no map. These dreams felt like pieces of a story not meant to end, but to ripple outward, carried by others long after his own voice was quiet. One night, as stars leaned close above them, Morty whispered, "I hope I don't forget this. I hope it always stays." Rick turned his gaze upward, where the constellations shimmered faintly. "Nothing ever really leaves," he murmured. "It just changes shape." Morty didn't answer, but he sighed, and the sound was full of trust. In that sigh, Rick heard the quiet truth. Their journey was not about solving the mystery of the council, or even about stepping through the waiting door. It was about creating memories that could live softly in the hearts of others, long after the paths themselves had faded, and as sleep finally folded around them both, Rick felt at peace with the thought that legacy was not a monument, but a whisper carried forward, a whisper that said he had been here, and he had cared. The nights had grown longer, though not in hours, but in feeling. Rick began to notice how each evening seemed to stretch out, as if time wanted to give him more space to reflect. He and Morty would sit together in quiet places, sometimes the hill, sometimes the pond, sometimes simply a corner of the street where shadows pooled, and their conversations grew fewer, though not emptier. It was as though silence itself had become the truest part of their bond. Rick often felt the council in these silences, not as figures standing before him, but as a hum woven into the air. Their presence no longer unsettled him. It was familiar now, like the breath of wind moving gently through leaves. He wondered if they had been with him since the beginning, not waiting to guide him, but waiting for him to notice. Morty sensed it too, though in his own way. Sometimes he would close his eyes and say softly, "I feel like something's watching us, but it doesn't feel scary." More like, "It's waiting to see what we'll do next." Rick would nod, because there was nothing else to say. The shimmer between worlds appeared less frequently now, but when it did it felt softer, dreamlike, as though the edges of reality had thinned. Once they stepped into a place where the air itself glowed, pale and golden, like dusk stretched forever. Shapes of birds moved high above, though they seemed carved from light, not feather. Morty reached out to touch one as it passed close, and though his fingers caught nothing, he smiled as though he had. Rick knew then that these crossings were not destinations. They were reflections, teaching them how to see the invisible beauty in what was already around them. One night, Morty asked in a drowsy voice, "Do you think we'll keep walking forever?" Rick thought for a long time. He looked at the horizon where the stars blurred into a faint haze and finally whispered, "Maybe, but even if we stop, the walking keeps going in someone else. That's the way it works." Morty was quiet after that, but Rick saw the boy's lips curve into a soft smile before sleep claimed him. Rick's dreams had changed too. The door was always there, but it no longer glowed with urgency. It stood quietly, like a friend waiting at the edge of the road. Sometimes he thought he heard laughter on the other side, faint but kind. Sometimes he felt as though the council was gathered there, not to judge, but to welcome him when the moment was right. And sometimes he wondered if stepping through would matter at all, because perhaps he had already been walking through it little by little. Each time he learned to care more deeply. There were moments when Rick felt the weight of time, not as fear, but as tenderness. He began to think more about the small ways a life could leave warmth behind, a glance that made someone feel seen, a gesture that softened someone's worry, a silence that let someone rest. He understood now that these were not accidents. They were the quiet legacy he was weaving, thread by thread. Without ever needing to announce it, Morty once murmured, "Half in dream, you'll be remembered." Rick looked at him, the boy's face peaceful in sleep, and answered softly, though Morty did not hear, "So will you." For he knew that the memory of their walking together, their listening together, would ripple outward, carried on in ways neither of them could measure. And as the night folded once again into stillness, Rick rested back against the earth and let the stars blur above him. The whispers of the council faded into the background, no longer separate from the rhythm of his own heart. He understood now that their origin was not hidden at all. It had been inside him, carried in the act of listening, waiting, caring. The world was quieter, softer, ready to be dreamt into. Rick began to feel the nights as though they were carrying him, as though each dusk folded into the next with softer seams. He and Morty still wandered, but their wandering grew slower, less about where they went, and more about how the air felt around them. Even the ordinary places seemed touched by quiet magic now. The pond rippled more slowly, the grass leaned closer to their steps, and the wind itself seemed to pause when they stopped to listen. It was in these pauses that Rick felt the presence of legacy most deeply. Not a grand inheritance, not monuments or names etched into stone, but something simpler, the sense that even their smallest moments were leaving threads behind. He realized that every time Morty laughed, every time someone's kindness lingered in their memory, it became part of the pattern, a pattern that would outlast them, woven quietly into the world. Morty, with his wide-eyed questions, seemed to sense it too. One evening, as they watched shadows stretch long across the hill, Morty asked, "Do you think the world remembers us even when we don't do anything?" Rick considered the question carefully. He thought of the way the council had appeared, not to test him, but to honor him. He thought of the shimmer between worlds, the way it always opened when he was ready, never when he demanded. And finally, he answered softly, "The world remembers the way you breathe. That's enough." Morty nodded, as though that was all he needed. Dreams blurred more now, as if the line between sleeping and waking was thinning. Rick often found himself standing before the door, but its light was no longer distant. It shimmered faintly even when he was awake, like a lantern glimpsed from the corner of his eye. He didn't feel pulled toward it anymore. He felt held by it, as though the door itself had been walking with him all along. Sometimes he even wondered if Morty could see it too, though the boy never spoke of it. Perhaps he didn't need to. Perhaps the silence between them was answer enough. Their bond had grown so steady that words became almost unnecessary. Morty would glance at him and Rick would already know what the boy meant to say. Rick would shift his weight and Morty would follow, trusting without question. These small harmonies carried more power than anything Rick had built with his hands. It was in this trust that Rick discovered the heart of what he had been searching for. Not invention, not discovery, but a companionship that made the unknown less lonely. The council's whispers returned once more, though only as a faint echo in the rhythm of his own thoughts. They did not ask him to step forward, nor did they remind him of his gift. They only hummed in quiet agreement, as though affirming what he already knew, that he had found what mattered. It was not hidden power, nor a secret to unravel. It was this, sitting on a hill as night drifted in, listening to Morty hum softly to himself and letting the stars lean closer, as though they too wished to rest. Rick tilted his head back and let his eyes blur until the constellations melted into one another. For the first time, he felt no need to solve their patterns, no urge to chart their paths. It was enough simply to look, to feel, to let them shine. He thought quietly that this was what legacy truly was. Not the act of being remembered, but the act of letting the world glow a little softer because you had been part of it. Morty's voice, drowsy, broke the stillness. "We'll keep walking, won't we?" Rick didn't hesitate. He placed a hand gently on Morty's shoulder and whispered, "As long as we need to." It was not a promise of forever, but of presence, which was all anyone truly had to give. Morty smiled faintly, eyes closing, and the night folded around them like a lullaby. And Rick, for once, did not think of tomorrow. He only rested, content to drift with the silence, carrying nothing but the peace of knowing they were exactly where they were meant to be. The nights had grown so gentle now that Rick sometimes wondered if he was still walking through the same world at all. The edges of things blurred, the streets, the hills, even the spaces between words, and what remained was a kind of quiet music, slow and unbroken. He and Morty still wandered, but their footsteps had taken on the rhythm of a lullaby, carrying them not toward discovery, but toward reflection. Rick felt the weight of time differently here. It no longer pressed on him, no longer urged him forward. It rested instead like a hand on his shoulder, reminding him that every moment could be enough. He thought of the council less as distant watchers and more as companions, folded into the silence that walked with him. Sometimes, when the air stilled, he could almost hear them breathing with him, patient and unhurried. Morty seemed to feel it too. He no longer filled the air with questions, but with soft observations. The way shadows curved around their path, the way the wind changed direction as they paused, the way the stars seemed to drift closer each night. Once in a whisper he said, "I think the world is listening to us." Rick only nodded because he felt it too. The sense that their journey had become less about where they went and more about how the world leaned gently to meet them. The door still waited in Rick's dreams, but now it was almost transparent, its glow fading into something softer, something woven into the very air he breathed. He realized that stepping through might not be an act of crossing at all, but an act of letting go. Not of Morty, not of the journey, but of the need to hold it too tightly. Perhaps the door was not a passage, but a reminder that every step had already been enough. One evening, as they rested beneath a tree, Morty leaned against him and whispered, "Do you think stories ever end?" Rick thought for a long time before answering. Not really. They just drift. Someone else picks them up. Someone else carries them on. Morty closed his eyes and smiled, as though that was all he had wanted to hear. Rick looked at him then, this companion who had walked beside him so faithfully, and felt the ache of tenderness settle deep in his chest. It was not sorrow. It was the quiet knowing that their bond would last beyond words, beyond ending. As night thickened, the stars above them blurred into soft clusters of light. Rick felt his body relax in a way it rarely had before, as though even his bones had learned how to rest. The whispers of the council faded into the distance, no longer calling, no longer guiding. They had become part of him, part of the way he listened, part of the way he cared. Morty's breathing slowed into sleep, and Rick let his eyes drift closed. He felt the night folding around them, not as a boundary but as a cradle. He thought of all the worlds they had seen, all the silences they had shared, and knew that none of it was lost. Every step had left a trace, not carved in stone, but carried in memory, in kindness, in the simple act of being. And as the stars leaned closer, Rick understood that his legacy was not hidden, not waiting behind a door. It was here, in this moment, in the bond that had made the journey beautiful. A bond that would ripple outward, soft as a lullaby, long after the walking was done. The world seemed slower now, though it was not time that slowed, but perception. Rick and Morty walked together through the fading light, their steps soft, almost unnoticeable, as if the earth itself had grown careful beneath them. The air was filled with the quiet shimmer of memory. The pond, the hill, the streets, all softened edges now, familiar and tender. Rick realized that the journey was no longer about moving forward. It was about being fully and gently in each passing moment. Morty hummed a small tune, barely audible, and Rick felt the notes wrap around them like a soft blanket. It was the kind of melody that could exist nowhere but here, nowhere but in their shared silence. They did not speak, for words felt unnecessary. They only walked, only listened, letting the faint sounds of the world, rustling leaves, distant laughter, the night breathing, fill the space between them. Rick thought of the council one last time. He no longer needed their guidance, nor even their presence. Their whispers had become part of him, soft as his own heartbeat, a gentle reminder that listening was more important than understanding. They had taught him that belonging was never about distance or power, but about presence. Simple, quiet, unwavering. The door, once luminous and beckoning, appeared again in his dreams. This time it was smaller, less urgent, and filled with the warmth of memory. Rick knew that stepping through it was not necessary. He felt no fear, no longing, only the calm realization that the threshold had always been a reflection of what he carried within himself. Patience, care, and a quiet strength born from companionship. Morty leaned against him, heavy with sleep, and whispered, "Will we keep walking?" Rick smiled softly, feeling the warmth of the boy's trust, and replied, "We'll keep walking, as long as it feels right." He knew now that walking was not about distance, nor about discovery. It was about presence. It was about leaving soft echoes wherever they went. And in that presence, he felt a completeness that no door or dream could surpass. The stars above seemed to hum, faint and distant, carrying light like tiny promises. Rick tilted his head back, letting the glow wash over him, feeling it in his chest, in his mind, in the slow rhythm of his breathing. Morty stirred, but did not wake, and Rick let the night fold around them both like a cradle, letting the quiet wrap them completely. He thought of every step they had taken together, every small act of care, every shared silence. He realized that legacy was not about monuments or remembrance, but about the soft ways one shapes the world around them, how a hand held, a glance offered, a quiet presence can ripple outward, unnoticed but lasting. And somewhere, far beyond dreams and waking, Rick and Morty rested beneath the stars. Their journey had no conclusion, only gentle continuation, and in that continuation they found peace. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's gonna be okay, man.